Tonight we travel to a place of stone and silence, to a world of cold floors and candlelight, to medieval Europe, somewhere around the year 1000, deep in the countryside, behind high stone walls. There is a monastery, and inside that monastery, men have chosen a life that most of us could barely imagine. Tonight you are not a warrior. You are not a merchant or a farmer. Tonight you are a monk, a man who has given up everything, his family, his freedom, his sleep, in service to God. And as we step quietly through those heavy stone doors, let your breathing slow. Let the world outside grow distant, because the life of a medieval monk was long and cold and deeply, deeply quiet, and it will carry you gently into sleep. How did a man become a monk? Sometimes it was his own choice. A deep and genuine calling, a desire to leave the noise of the world behind, to dedicate every hour of every day to prayer. But sometimes it was not his choice at all. Many monks were given to the monastery as young children by their families. This was called oblation. A family with too many sons or too little money to feed them all would bring a young boy, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old, to the monastery gates and leave him there. The child had no say, no choice. He simply stayed and grew up inside those walls, learning to read in Latin, learning the prayers, learning the long, slow rhythms of the monastic life. By the time he was old enough to truly understand what had happened, the monastery was the only world he knew, the only home he had, and so he stayed. Not always because he wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The monk's day was built around prayer, 8 times every day. The bell rang, and everything stopped. Whatever the monk was doing, working, reading, eating, resting, everything stopped, and he walked to the church to pray. The first prayer of the day was called Matins. It happened in the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning. The bell rang in the darkness, and the monks rose from their beds, in the cold, in the dark, and walked to the stone church and prayed for an hour, sometimes longer. Then they returned to their beds for a few more hours of sleep before the bell rang again, at sunrise, for the next prayer called lauds, and so the day continued, prayer after prayer, hour after hour, marking the slow passage of time, with words that had been spoken in exactly the same way for hundreds of years before them. Let us slow down for a moment and truly imagine what it felt like to be woken at 2 in the morning every single night, not occasionally, not sometimes, every night, for the rest of your life. The monastery dormitory was a long, cold room, with rows of simple beds, no mattress of soft feathers, just a wooden frame, with a thin straw mat and a rough woolen blanket. The windows had no glass. Cold air moved freely through the stone room. In winter, the monks could see their breath, even indoors. The bell rang, and the monk opened his eyes into complete darkness, their voices low and slow and tired, rising and falling together in the cold darkness, night after night after night. Inside the monastery, there was very little talking. In many monasteries, silence was the rule, not just encouraged, but required. The monks had developed an elaborate system of hand signals. To communicate without words, a finger pointed down meant salt. 2 fingers rubbed together meant fish. A hand moved in a circle meant bread. Simple needs, communicated in silence. Meals were eaten in silence, while one monk read aloud. From a religious text, the others ate and listened, and did not speak. Work was done in silence. Walking between buildings was done in silence, even in the scriptorium, where monks sat copying manuscripts. For hours and hours, not a word was spoken, only the soft scratching of quills on parchment, and the occasional turning of pages. The silence was so complete, so total, that new monks sometimes found it unbearable. The absence of ordinary human sound was its own kind of weight, a heaviness that pressed down, day after day, until eventually silence itself became comfortable, became home. The food in a medieval monastery was simple, very simple. The main meal of the day, usually eaten around midday, consisted of bread, dark, heavy bread, made from coarse grain, a bowl of pottage, which was a thick soup, made from dried peas or beans, perhaps some vegetables from the monastery garden, leeks, onions, turnips, a small piece of cheese, sometimes dried fish. Meat was rarely permitted. In many monasteries, meat was forbidden entirely. except for the very sick. On feast days, there might be something extra, a little honey, an egg perhaps, some fruit from the orchard. These small additions were genuinely looked forward to. For weeks in advance, fasting was also common. Certain days of the week, and entire seasons of the church calendar, required the monks to eat less, or sometimes nothing at all, until the evening. A life of prayer and silence is also, it seems, a life of permanent, mild hunger. One of the most important jobs in the medieval monastery was copying books. The monks who did this work were called scribes, and they worked in a room called the scriptorium, a long room with high windows, designed to let in as much natural light as possible, because candles, near parchment and ink, were considered too dangerous. The scribe sat at a slanted wooden desk, with a piece of parchment before him. Parchment was made from stretched animal skin, thin, pale, and expensive. The scribe dipped his quill into ink and began to copy, letter by letter, word by word, line by line, page by page. Copying a single book could take months, sometimes an entire year. The work required absolute concentration. A single mistake could ruin an entire page, and parchment was far too valuable to waste. Mistakes had to be carefully scraped away with a small knife and rewritten. The monks sat in silence, in the cold light, hour after hour, their fingers aching, their eyes straining, preserving the knowledge of the ancient world, one careful letter at a time. Prayer and copying books were not the only work of the monastery. The monks also farmed. The monastery needed to feed itself, and so there were gardens, large vegetable gardens, herb gardens used for medicine, orchards of apple and pear trees, fields of grain beyond the walls. The monks worked these gardens, in silence, digging, planting, weeding, harvesting, in the rain and in the heat, in the cold mud of early spring, and the dry dust of late summer. There were also other tasks. Some monks brewed ale, which was safer to drink than water. Some kept bees for honey, some tended the fish ponds, providing the fish that appeared so frequently on the monastery table. Some monks worked in the kitchen, preparing the simple meals for the whole community. Some cared for the sick in the monastery's small infirmary, where local villagers sometimes came, seeking treatment. The monastery was in many ways a complete small world, almost entirely self-sufficient, quiet, ordered, and endlessly repetitive. When a monk grew old or fell sick, he was moved to the infirmary, a slightly warmer room, with slightly better food. The sick were permitted meat, and were allowed to sleep a little longer in the mornings. Small mercies, in a life of very few comforts. Many monks suffered from specific ailments, caused by the conditions of monastic life. Years of sitting hunched over manuscripts left many with curved spines and permanent pain in the neck and shoulders. Years of sleeping in cold stone rooms led to rheumatism, joint pain that worsened every winter. Years of limited diet led to nutritional deficiencies. And yet, many monks lived surprisingly long lives, longer than most medieval people, because the monastery provided something rare in the medieval world: regular food, even if simple, a roof over the head, even if cold, and a community around you, even if silent. In a world of enormous uncertainty, the monastery offered a kind of stability that most medieval people could only dream of. At the end of each day, as the last prayer faded, the monks returned to the dormitory, in silence, in darkness. They removed their sandals and lay down on their thin straw mats, pulling the rough woolen blanket close around them. The candles were extinguished, one by one, until the long room was completely dark. Outside the stone walls, the countryside was silent, no lights anywhere, only stars, and the soft movement of wind through the trees of the monastery orchard. The monks lay still, each in his own silence, each with his own quiet thoughts, knowing that in just a few hours, the bell would ring again, calling them back into the cold, into the dark, into the ancient words that had been spoken every night, for longer than anyone could remember. But for now, there was rest. Let that same stillness find you now. Let the stone walls rise up around you. Let the candles go dark, one by one. Let the monastery grow quiet and carry you slowly into a deep and restful sleep. Good night.